you. I'll just start the live stream then. Perfect, so we're live. And is everyone happy if I just drop the times in the chat? Cool. Sweet, well that covers it. So I call on the first affirming speaker to open the debate.
Just like for the POIs, just do a reaction or something like that. Indigenous people are hugely harmed by governments marketing their culture, their identity as simply a tourist attraction. Our burden in this debate is to prove that Indigenous cultures are even slightly harmed by these by this tourism marking. And this is so important because Indigenous people are like our main stakeholder and they are the most important people in this debate. So I just want to do some framing around why they are the most important. So Indigenous groups, all over the world in so many different countries have been the victims of colonization, where people came in, they took their land, they took their resources, they tried to set up schools to teach them out of their culture and tell them that their culture was worth less than English and things like that. And we see, so that's the historic harms. And then we see that these harms still act on them today in things like systemic racism, where we see Indigenous groups disproportionately populating our prisons, where we see things like Indigenous people being less likely to get selected for jobs. So all these harms, both historic and acting today, tell us that Indigenous groups are currently marginalised and that they are very important to protect. But they are also very important to protect, not just because they're been historically harmed and harmed today, but also because there is an inherent value of protecting that culture and making sure that it survives in the best, most authentic form it can within our countries, because we think there's value in that diversity and presenting and preserving an as authentic culture as we can. So now, because of that framing around what life is like for Indigenous people, all over the world, we can kind of think a little bit about what they probably want. So what's important to Indigenous people is a protection of their culture. And this looks like the links between their culture and their community being preserved. So if they live in a mostly Indigenous suburb or on a reserve or something like that, they want the area to be protected and to be able to live their most authentic culture there without too much interruption. So right from the start, we tell you that it doesn't really matter to them how many overseas people know about their culture, because that is not what is the most important to their day-to-day life. We tell you that they want things like reparations. They want things want their land back. They want compensation for these past harms, all crimes which have been, kind of committed by a colonial government. So that really nicely flows on into my first point, which is why the government is a really bad actor to be able to represent and promote this culture. So we've kind of established that nobody's being able to, it's kind of obvious that nobody is able to represent the culture as well as the people who are in the culture themselves. So kind of anyone else doing it is bad, but the government is particularly bad. And this, links to all the past harms that have happened. This, for specific examples, it looks like the stolen generation in Australia. It looks like our government banning Māori language. It looks like, all over the world, the land of Indigenous people being stolen and their resources being stolen and then being forced to work. All of these crimes, right, the government or, past governments have committed. And the government is motivated to cover that up. And they're not going to include that as a part of their advertising because obviously they want, people to see this culture as a really positive thing. So they're not going to be oh, hey guys, here's all these really, really horrible things we did. But hey, come to the place where we massacred the Indigenous people. They're not going to do that because, nobody's going to come. And then when they start relying on this tourism income, with Indigenous cultures, that the tourism starts relying on the attraction of these Indigenous cultures, they're even more motivated to cover it up and not say the truth of what happened and not apologize. So what are the impacts of this? It means that we will never fully represent the culture. There's not the increased awareness that our side would claim, because this is not a true awareness, because the government firstly just doesn't know about this culture, and they're like inclined to cover up the past harms and like the history of the culture, which is really important to it today. This is also going to undermine like the struggle for rights that Indigenous people have today, because like it's just another like narrative whitewashing their culture. So when they're trying to say, hey guys, there's really bad things happen to us and we want reparations, people are going to be like, oh no, but I saw these ads and stuff and like I think everything's fine. It's just another whitewash narrative that is covering up like the voices of these actual Indigenous people. So we see more people disinformed about the culture in New Zealand and overseas. We see the experience undermined. So that's like getting less people on your side when you're trying to create action, because they don't have a true understanding of the history of the culture. And we also just think that it's very like mentally harmful for the people in that culture to see like the things that have happened to them be covered up. We also think that there are really significant harms when people visit these places in person. Because we think like when it becomes a tourist attraction, a place where Indigenous people live, maybe there's probably other tourism businesses like spring up around this area, which further like dilutes the authenticity and the ability of this culture that like lives in this area to live freely in the way they'd want to live, because other people are like coming in and just like being in that space that used to be just theirs. And this links back to what's important to these cultures. Like I said right from the start, what's important to them is being able to preserve their culture, live in their community, express their culture to the best, most authentic way they can. And when we're encouraging tourists to come in and invade that space, that is very harmful to them. It stops them from being able to do that. If they wanted to like promote their culture, they would do it themselves, and they would do it on their own terms. We also think people take this like bad representation, this misrepresentation of this culture back to other countries, and it just furthers misinformation. It also encourages people to view these people as an other, as an object, which increases racism. That's really negative. We don't want people to view these Indigenous cultures as an object, as an attraction. And then the environment is very harmed. And we see this happening in island nations like Fiji, like Hawaii, that rely heavily on tourism, that is often, linked to like people wanting to visit these Indigenous cultures. When the government focuses on promoting these Indigenous cultures for the tourism, all the tourism is going to like be focused around these Indigenous areas, and then these Indigenous areas get polluted by careless tourists coming and like littering all around. And if something gets damaged or there's huge pollution, it's hard for these Indigenous groups to clean it up, because as we said, they're disenfranchised. They don't have as many resources as other like sectors of society would have. So it's harder for them to like clean up their beaches and clean up their area. And we see like not only is now their community infiltrated by other people, we see like their spiritual areas, like whether that be a beach or something like that, because we see a lot of Indigenous cultures having a link to the land, and that being important in this culture. Now that is polluted as well. So we stand for Indigenous people being able to live their life on their own terms, represent their own culture, how they want it to be represented. Thank you.
Awesome. Judges, are we... Cool. I thank the speaker for that speech and call on the first negating speaker to begin their team's case.
Is everything audible? Perfect. I'll take POIs in chat, but I might ask for them as well. Promotion is not synonymous with disrespect. This is something AF fundamentally misunderstands, because on side negating, Indigenous people gain awareness, they gain status, they gain resources. On affirmative, they get nil. We support the real world where this promotion happens, and where governments support these Indigenous groups through marketing. And there are two ways we can win this debate. Firstly, that we show that there is a better awareness of Indigenous cultures, that better awareness arises once we have this tourism happening. And secondly, that more resources therefore go towards Indigenous people when we have tourism, when we have marketing happening. And we have 3 points on this side of the house. I'll be talking about firstly, how Indigenous cultures benefit directly from this marketing even happening. And secondly, how Indigenous cultures benefit from the act of tourism as a result of this marketing. Hunter's going to split on why this encourages governments to treat Indigenous people better. But before I talk about that, I've got 2 points of rebuttal against the first affirmative speaker. The rest will largely be integrated. Firstly, AF really focused on having these advancements, having these structural changes, and we completely agree that there have been historic harms, grievous harms towards Indigenous people. But the problem with this is that affirmative has no clear model as to how they're even going to make any of these changes happen, apart from demanding reparations, which firstly is just so empirically ineffective. Like, if reparations worked, then no Indigenous cultures would be ostracized, would be marginalized, if their voice is so significant in the face of a big government body that, like affirmative stated, has these colonialist attitudes towards them. And secondly, on our side of the house, we actually have these changes because having tourism, having attraction correlates these people with value, even if this is the most selfish way to achieve that. More on this later in my second point. And secondly, quickly on this small point about environmental pollution, a dirty beach is not attractive to tourists, and therefore governments are incentivized to clean them up, again, even for the most selfish reasons of gaining tourism. I'm not sure how this stands. Okay, so firstly, how do Indigenous cultures benefit from marketing? And we have 3 points under this. Firstly, why do we get respectful advertising? And 3 things under here. Firstly, that tourists want authentic experiences. Clearly, the tourists that do come, that are interested, care about understanding Indigenous culture. They care about gaining educational insights. Otherwise, they would just go to any other tourist attraction. Even if, these depictions of, in the worst case scenario, even if these depictions of Indigenous people in this advertising is not accurate, we still have positive correlations. We still have positive connotations of these Indigenous people shown through advertising, because secondly, that governments are incentivized to make money from these tourists, and therefore they understand that a poorly made ad is not going to attract people that is already classified as interested in Indigenous cultures. Thirdly, what this means is that even if it's not wholly accurate, we still have these positive connotations. We still have respect towards these Indigenous people, because the subtext of these ads is admiration of diversity. Therefore, we get no clear harms if AF wants to push anything about these ads being about appropriation. Secondly, it's actually fundamentally worse in AF's world. We have no advertising, because we understand that Indigenous groups don't have the resources to market themselves because of all those structural reasons that First Affirmative came out with, and we agree with. And so therefore, any world in which there is marketing for tourism can only be provided through governmental bodies, through bodies which have the ability to run these campaigns. And so thirdly, Indigenous cultures benefit from marketing because it's highly likely that this marketing won't be misleading. And there are 2 reasons under here. Firstly, about accountability, because if you see a YouTube ad about New Zealand depicting Māori people in a very inaccurate way, that's going to be in our globalized, highly social age, that will be all over Twitter in a few hours. Some iwi will speak out about it. There's going to be backlash if it's significantly harmful. The New Zealand government does not want to be tried and sentenced by the court of public opinion, especially on something as political as Indigenous people. And so they're going to consult Indigenous people for accurate representation in their advertisement, in their advertisements. They're not going to be these very weird, gentrified or rose-tinted rose-tinted like depictions. But even if they are these gentrified rose-tinted appropriations of these people, like as established, tourists value authenticity. So if they arrive somewhere and realize that advertising was thoroughly misleading, that it doesn't correlate to how these Indigenous people really are, then these tourists who already are willing to choose and pay $8,000 for a niche experience in relation to other tourist attractions, they're going to care enough to therefore call that out because they care about Indigenous people. And so governments, again, are held accountable. They will act with foresight in their advertising. I'll take a point if you have one.
Sorry. Do you not suppose at the point that Indigenous history of mass slaughter events will be forgotten when the government is narrating the story?
Absolutely not, because the government is not narrating the story. And I'm just about to talk about why this needs Indigenous consent, why none of this can happen without Indigenous approval. Therefore, we don't have these very twisted narratives happening. So how do Indigenous cultures benefit from the act of tourism as a result of this advertising, as a result of this marketing? 5 reasons for this. Firstly, that again, consent is required for a lot of these activities. American Indians have tribal sovereignty over their land. They can control which businesses enter their lands. They're not going to allow businesses that are clearly bigoted to come in and desecrate these spaces. Similarly, even without direct ownership of land, groups like iwi create experiences that require engagement, that require a consent of physical participation. So therefore, if governments have these Indigenous people employed at some capacity to create these authentic experiences and attract more tourists like they're incentivized to do, they will treat those Indigenous groups well, and they're going to pay them well, because otherwise without that relation, they're not going to have any authentic experience to sell to tourists. Secondly, Indigenous cultures benefit because if something is a tourist attraction, then governments are incentivized to invest to make those areas better, more appealing. Regardless of intent, Māori, for example, will get an immediate renovation of a marae. That's a clear short-term benefit. But also, thirdly, in the long term, money is being funneled from international tourists into the pockets of these Indigenous groups through this tourism that's coming in. Firstly, this is the best possible form of investment that the government is going to actively encourage, because all money is external, on the balance of trade. This can only be positive. Secondly, that this money goes towards income. It goes towards schooling for some of these most marginalized individuals. This is where we get our structural changes. And thirdly, that on the comparative, what really AF is standing for is that none of this happens because there are no tourists, there is no money being funneled into these groups. The government clearly doesn't care about them because there hasn't been any change. So even in the worst case scenario on our side, if a state doesn't even care about these people, they're still going to attract tourists, and the economic impacts that these Indigenous groups get are independent. And also since AF is standing for their since AF is standing for there being $0 given into this communities, we see that really clearly. AF has talked about how they value protection of their cultures. We see that very clearly with revealed preference that American Indian casinos provide some of the most atrocious forms of cultural appropriation to tourists, and they agree to do this. They consent to this because they prefer having hard, cold cash and making changes themselves to cultural validation. This revealed preference shows that they can capitalize on this narrative. They're willing to do this. I'm very proud to be on the real side of Indigenous people. Thank you.
Cool, I thank the speaker for that speech and call on the second affirming speaker to continue the affirmative case.
Can I please have POIs in the chat?
The negating team has come up and talked to us about how the government cares about Indigenous people and they care about providing, this authentic experience to tourists. But there is no world in which the government comes out and it admits, in these advertising campaigns to people, all the horrible things they've done to Indigenous people, where it admits, the massive ways it set back Indigenous culture and Indigenous society. And on that fact alone, they fail to properly represent Indigenous people because they fail to show the wrongs that have been done to them and why, and how this affects them. But what we see is, as the government advertises, these cultures and advertises these people, we see them become commercialized. They become objects, because what we see is, people are paying for, or coming to these countries and paying to see people, be of this culture. And, this is morally abhorrent because, it turns these people and their culture into a product. It turns them into something you can just buy. And what this does is it turns these Indigenous people into, subhuman things because they're just a product, something to buy, a way for the government to create revenue. And so, and by highlighting, Indigenous people as being different and other, it leads to horrible outcomes like racism and, people not treating them equally. So they see, worse outcomes. And then, like, I also wanted to talk about how, on the topic of how the government represents Indigenous groups, the negating team has talked about how people will complain and they will, talk about how this isn't what it was like when I was there. But this ignores the fact that the government just, can simply fail to tell the whole story, and that already horribly misrepresents, Indigenous people and their cultures. And so when we look at this as a comparison between the negating world and the affirming world, what actually changes? We've both agreed that, Indigenous people are what really matter, and they've, they need, financial reparations for, harms in the past. So what is the difference between these two worlds? Well, under the negating side, what we see is the government continues to do horrible harms to Indigenous people. I'm happy to take that, POI.
Yeah, no.
How exactly do you resolve these issues of racism on your side of the house?
So, as I'm about to go on to, so under the negating side, we see, like continued like commercialization, continued horrible harms to these Indigenous people, as they're sold off as products, and that advertised, and they aren't representing who they are, what their culture represents, and and denying the fact that they've done these horrible things to them in the past. And so what this means is we don't see, more money going to Indigenous or like better lives for Indigenous people because they, experience, racism through, this idea of objectification and commercialization. And, they have people just appropriating their culture and taking away what makes it special through, through this commercialization and making it a sellable product rather than really teaching people about the authentic culture. And so under the affirming side, we see this, is completely different. We see much better lives for Indigenous people because they are able to share their culture with people on their terms. They're able to decide, if they want to sell off that, if they want to sell their culture, and they get to decide what they present to people instead of, presenting a government approved idea of what's happened to them and why and how their culture is. They get to really say what they want and, have it really represent who they are, and, and also have a platform to call out the government on these, horrible things they've done in the past. And so this system, was that a POI there? I'm happy to take the POI.
Sorry. Is the government not better on our side of the house where they're actively incentivized through tourism to better treat these Indigenous people and improve their living spaces?
We don't see this necessarily as being true because what actually the government is incentivized to do is to kind of produce the most marketable version of a culture and incentivize to kind of create a culture that conforms to what is most easily marketable, what people want to see, and not actually represent that culture. There's no incentive there to represent the culture. There is an incentive to make as much money as possible. And we don't see them doing this by improving the living spaces of these Indigenous people. We see them doing this by manufacturing a culture, like taking away the bits that they see as disagreeable, and only then helping them once they've kind of renounced their culture and conform to an ideal that is more palatable to the government. And so we actually don't see the government having an incentive to provide reparations for Indigenous people under the other side of the house. Instead, they're incentivized to best commercialize it. And so in all of these cases, we see better outcomes for Indigenous people under the affirmative side of the house, because they're not being turned into a product. They're not being turned into something to sell. And that is where a lot of the fundamental flaws come in the negating team's cases. I also wanted to talk quickly about how this affects, place like island nations where they have a big tourism industry. I'm going to take that POI.
Sorry about that, we opened something. Even if we have this worst case scenario of appropriation, is it not better for Indigenous people to get paid for their consent to that appropriation than to get paid nothing at all?
So what the negating team is suggesting is that these Indigenous people give up their culture, in order to make as much money as possible. But under our side of the house, we see them having options other than that. Instead of advertising through the government, where as the negating team has just admitted, they're kind of forced to give up on their culture and just to make this money, they can advertise on their own or with a private company in order to really put out something that represents them and their culture, so that they're able to still make this money. Because we don't stand against tourism, and cultural tourism. We stand against the government advertising tourism based on these cultures. And so we see a much healthier cultural tourism industry under our side of the house. Thank you.
Cool. Cool. I thank the speaker for that speech and invite the second speaker of the negating team to continue the team's case.
Indigenous people are some of the most misunderstood, some of the most marginalized people within the global community. That is why we, on Side Negating, stand for a world where there is greater awareness for these people, there is greater amount of money going into these communities, and there is greater attention to the issues that are suffering, rather than pushing them away from the government's incentives like Side Affirming wants to do, allowing them to work on their own rather than having the government to give them a hand in actually improving their livelihoods. What am I going to do in my speech here today? 3 things. Firstly, how is the representation of these people likely to look? Secondly, what are the practical outcomes of this form of tourism when tourists come? And then thirdly, why it encourages governments to treat Indigenous people better. Let's move into representation then, which is where side affirming has spent the vast majority of their case talking. On second, they told us, and they've continually pushed down the line, that this representation is unlikely to represent the horrible historical atrocities that has happened to these Indigenous people. Three responses to this. Firstly, we tell you that all these horrible historical atrocities don't actually get mentioned or get any attention on their side because there's no advertising that is able to be done. There's no ability for these horrible historical atrocities to actually come into the public sphere of knowledge, so they lose all of this material anyway. Secondly, then, we actually tell you we get better knowledge of historical atrocities because when you have an ad that has some Māori Indigenous or South American Indigenous people, and you're a tourist wanting to go there, you might do a bit of research now online and look up how these people how these people act or how these people live within that society. You're going to look it up and then you may find information about those atrocities. You can then learn about it. And even if you don't learn about it, but you eventually do go to that country and you go to Indigenous communities, like you go to a marae or you go to the Northern Territory in Australia or the Amazon, for example, and you interact with those communities now, you can then learn about those historical oral narratives of things like historical atrocities and stuff like that. When there's no incentive for tourists to actually create a connection and go to these countries, which side affirming isn't actually able to claim, they don't get any acknowledgement of things like horrible historical atrocities. Secondly, then, about Indigenous people are likely to be represented badly, and this is likely to lead to things like racism. We tell you, firstly, that racism is actually worse on their side when there is no knowledge of the struggle of these people or a lack of awareness. It means that all people do hear about are very sort of straw man cases about how these Indigenous people interact within their society. There's no incentive for people to actually create some level of awareness or actually learn about these people's stories. Secondly, then we tell you that it's actually better on our side because when these tourists go to these Indigenous communities, they're able to communicate with these people, they're able to learn about these cultures, they're able to interact with these Indigenous people, and they're then in turn able to become less racist if we want to take side affirming's model because they're going to actually understand these people's struggles and understand these people's perspectives. Thirdly, we also tell you that there's likely to be a greater amount of pride in your culture as an Indigenous person because there's an increased amount of value put onto it. We tell you what is the actual comparative in this debate. We tell you, one, that the government values your culture and sees it as economically valuable or principally valuable, hence why we're putting it in a tourist ad, or on their comparative where the government pretty much just straight up ignores you and doesn't care about your culture. There's a greater amount of pride in your culture as a Māori Indigenous person or as an Australian Indigenous person when in that big ad for Come to New Zealand, and Māori Indigenous culture is put up there, up next to beaches and hiking tracks and mountains and whatever. You feel a value in your culture and that it is significant rather than brushed under the rug. Fourthly, then, we tell you that there's this principle of revealed preference. Alyssa brought you examples of people within Native American communities who have things like casinos and allow people to come here. Clearly, and clearly people who allow the Indigenous communities that allow people onto their land clearly value that money over things like cultural representation. These people, you get more people coming in, which means more people can learn about that culture and interact with those people. They tried to push us then at the end of their second speech that these people are simply able to advertise on their own. We tell you that if you buy all of their material, that Indigenous people don't have a lot of money and are historically disenfranchised, we don't see why they're actually going to have the amount of capital to get primetime TV ads in the United States or the United Kingdom to get tourists to come over here. Clearly, they don't have the ability to do that. All right. Finally, then, about how they're likely to make this a more palatable culture. We tell you that this is kind of going against their idea that the representation is likely to be negative. But we already brought you analysis from Alyssa about how even if the culture is represented badly, even if it's seen as more palatable, when you eventually go as a tourist there, you're able to see, okay, this representation is bad. You're able to go online and you're able to talk about it. They also didn't respond to any of our material about how this is culturally likely to be a positive representation, so that material still stands. Then finally, on the practical outcomes, we brought you a bunch of material about how you are getting money into these communities and you're interacting with these communities. We didn't really hear much of a response from this, so this material still stands. The main push they wanted to push on us, though, was the thing about reparations. Now, reparations is actually worse on-side affirming side. Why is this the case? Because we tell you what is the comparative. We tell you it's either a government assigns no value to these Indigenous communities, doesn't put any attention on them, and doesn't see them as valuable in the national ethos, or they do think that there's a value in it in the national ethos, they do put attention on it. Who is more likely to get reparations? The latter, obviously, because there's an incentive on both among domestic people and international communities to actually pay out these reparations and like redo historical wrongdoings instead of just ignoring these people like side affirming is going to do anyway. I'll take a point now if you have one. Okay, to move into my split material about why we encourage governments to treat Indigenous people better. Let's look at governments firstly who are currently advertising for like Indigenous cultural people within their society. 4 reasons why we treat them better. Firstly, we tell you that tourists want authentic experiences. And so there's an incentive for governments to make these experiences authentic. We tell you that if you're a tourist and you just want to get a very palatable experience, a very fun experience, you're likely to just go somewhere like Disneyland or go somewhere like Paris where you can get that. If you fork out the amount of money to actually go into like and live in an Indigenous society in Africa, for example, for like, or live somewhere in South America, you're likely to want an authentic experience. It means that the governments are likely to maintain that. It means all of the material about environmental damage is gone, and we actually get investment on our side because governments have an incentive to make these places like look better and be more attractive for tourists to come. Secondly, we tell you you get greater accountability and backlash for bad representation by governments, or if governments are positively representing things but are actually treating their Indigenous people badly. We tell you, if, like, for example, China's running an ad about their Uyghur Muslims, you raise more awareness about those Uyghur Muslims, and then people see, okay, they're getting treated badly, you get that backlash mechanism. Thirdly, we tell you that Indigenous groups are likely to have internal voices. Both sides agree on this. And we tell you that the government is likely wanting to keep making money. So they're going to treat these Indigenous people badly. Otherwise, people in their Marais or people within their native like American settlements are going to say, we don't want any tourists coming here. We're closing our borders, closing our doors until we get a better deal. They have a bargaining power on our side. And fourthly, we tell you that when Indigenous groups are making money, people domestically care about these people because they feel they're contributing to the economy. Because we're the side that has better representation and better outcomes, we're so proud to stand on side negating.
I will just take POIs in the chat, please.
Sweet. Cool, I thank the speaker for that speech and call on the third speaker of the affirming team to continue the team's case.
So what burdens did we as the affirmative side have to prove today? We had to prove that either the government is better acting in advocating for something else for tourism, or that Indigenous groups are better actors than the government in this debate. So 2 points of clash today, in this debate. Firstly, what is the best actor to promote Indigenous groups? And secondly, what is the effect of Indigenous groups on the neg side? So first, I will just kind of looking at the first point of clash. So what does Neg's case kind of hinge on today in this point? What do they have to prove in order to win this point of clash? So they have to prove that the government can provide the best education on these Indigenous groups in the form of tourism. So 3 reasons to why this is just inherently not true. Firstly, historical neglection. So we came out at first and we told you that because of these historical neglections and this issue, that governments are not inclined, when we link in profitability, they are not inclined to talk about this historical neglection to promote this because tourists are going to be like, okay, why the hell would I want to go to a place that slaughtered their Indigenous people? You know, the government is actually going to profit off of surface level cultural aspects, things like greenstones in New Zealand and in Australia, you know, like tokens and things that represent Indigenous people there. What we would actually see is we'd see, like, you know, the haka or marae trips in New Zealand. They will not, the government is not going to go, hey, come see Parihaka where we raped and we raped women and children. What an exciting place to come visit. We just think that because of this history is going to be lost. And at the point where the negating team wants to argue that because of this, because they're getting this, they're getting seen by tourists and things like that, the people are going to be advocating for them. We just think this one is inherently not true, because people, tourists don't care. They come and they do what is, they do the things that when they wanted to be there for. They go on their marae trip, they go they go on their haka trip, things like that. They do not, at a base level, care about the Indigenous groups, especially at the point where the government is supplying this tourism. The government is not going to go, hey, let's go to this, marae with Indigenous people. They're going to have government officials or people they hire to act as, the educators, who are not going to talk about this, things like that. It is just going to get forgotten. And I think we have proved this, and such we went on this. But at the point where the government does do a good enough education on, on this, in this tourism, we still think it is not their place to profit. Morally, if you think about this just at a base level, what is the government? How is the government allowed to come in and go, yes, we would love to profit off of Indigenous groups? Where is the moral aspect of that? At the point where they want to say that money will go back into these Indigenous groups, we just think at a base level, this, there is a small chance of this happening, because first off, the government is going to create these schemes, they're going to create these advertisements. They're not going to be relying on Indigenous, already existing Indigenous maraes and things like that to make this profit. Therefore, there is no reason for them to pay it back to the Indigenous groups. Them selling greenstone, them profiting off of and marketing greenstone, fake greenstone, in what way do they have to pay it back to their groups? I will take a POI before I move on to my second clash.
If you're a tourist, do you think you're more likely to go to an authentic marae experience led by Māori people, or a fake government-created marae like you're describing now?
At the point where a tourist is going for their own monetary value, I think, where a tourist, actually, that benefits one of the ways we win. So we actually, in what I said in the beginning was that one of our burdens is that we have to prove that actually Indigenous groups would be better actors in this debate than the government. So at the point where tourists are promoting their maraes themselves, then we think, at the point where Indigenous groups are promoting their maraes themselves, tourists are more inclined to go to that as a whole anyway. We think that at the point where the government is doing this, it's the government isn't going to be able to act in correlation with these authentic things, because we don't think Indigenous people are going to agree to this. So what does our world look like when we prove this? When we prove this point of clash? So our world looks like when acting, when the Indigenous groups are acting as this actor in this debate, we see, less inclination for tourists to be, culturally appropriating different aspects of the culture. What we see mostly on the next side of the house is we see, people getting a very base level understanding of our culture. We'll see things like, there was a thing on TikTok came out of people mocking the haka. We think that this would be highly more prevalent under their side of the house because of this base level education by the government. Moving on to my second point of clash. What is the effect on Indigenous groups? So again, what did NEG have to rely on today to win this point of clash? They had to rely on the fact that Indigenous people actually care about what tourists think. So, and also that the government is going to use these, Indigenous places. I've already kind of covered this, but on a first burden. So reason why this is not true, why Māori and Indigenous people in general do not care about what tourists think. First of all, Indigenous people value being able to express themselves. They value being appreciated in their own country. They value being looked at as real people in their country. You don't come out here and you go you don't profit off of general people in the public. We've talked about how this makes them seem like objects. It makes them seem like a fun part of our society, when in reality, majority of their history in our country is bad. And I think at the point where the government is trying to profit off this, this is extremely harmful to the narrative, and we have honed this in today. So secondly, the reason why this is also not true is tourists litter and ruin these, places. They talked about how the government would be inclined to clean this up. I think at the point where there is just like, it doesn't even have to be littering as physical, like rubbish. It can be like, you know, the degrading of the environment around them, like the pathways and, you know, like trees and environment around them, which is something Indigenous people really care about, which we have also honed down in today's debate. So even if at the point where Indigenous people care about what tourists think, they are going to promote their own personal things. And we think at this point, this is very key in this debate, because when the Indigenous people are promoting their own culture, they are promoting their aspects they want shared of it. When the government is promoting their culture, they get to pick and choose whatever exciting thing they think the Indigenous group will sell best. At the point where the Indigenous groups get to promote what they think is valuable and what they're sharing, then we think this is highly valuable to these Indigenous groups. And we see the profits that the other side claims we don't have. We see the actually more direct profits into these Indigenous groups, because otherwise the government is at their best giving them slightly small monetary values. So what does our world look like under this point of clash? It looks like tourists, you know, less tourists going to these sacred places, being less inclined to go to these sacred places because they don't know about them. At the point where we have to give up a small tourist value that they bring, we think this is highly more important in this debate and protecting our environment. We think we win based on the fact that we proved our burdens, that we improve, we keep Indigenous lives stable, and that we can also win on the point that governments are not good actors in this debate. Thank you.
Cool. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now call on the third negating speaker to wrap up the substantive portion of this evening's debate.
You are now. You are now.
Am I audible? Good. Okay, cool. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. The point at which the AF side of the House lost this debate is when they imagined that all these acts of showing this culture involve no consent, involve no buy-in, and that Indigenous people are completely helpless victims through all time, in all senses, in all cases, with no power to determine how they are shown, and with no power to make choices about trading off accuracy for income. This absurd world is the only one in which the AF can possibly win this debate. And I will show through these points of clash that this is simply not the world we have. First point of clash: what is the quality of the representation in these ads going to be like? We've brought you strongly straight from first that these will be respectful. There'll be iwi engagement because of a backlash, because of backlash. If it's not respectful, there's going to be, and there's a direct incentive because the kinds of tourists you're gonna will be invested in this kind of thing. And even if it's not completely accurate, it will be a positive portrayal, if not an accurate one, simply because you want people. Why would you show them something bad? In any world, it is a positive portrayal. And we think that in our world, it's very likely it will be actually quite an accurate one, as there'll be engagement from all parties in the creation of this ad, as a state does not want to end up on some YouTube video of top 10 most offensive ads in history. This backlash from people and everybody is very clear, and you cannot deny it. Now, what they've said here is that the massive harm is denied historical atrocities and how attention will not be paid to these issues. First of all, I don't see much of that happening now, and I don't see much of that happening internationally now, any awareness raised by individual iwi of these problems internationally, which is what we're talking about. So even if we lose everything here, it is symmetric, but it's not, because it actually gets worse on their side. That is for a few reasons. One, if you have no attention whatsoever, no promotion of these people. If an American doesn't know what an Aborigine is, it's very unlikely that that same American who we're arguing about is going to invest any time or any effort in finding out what the experience of these people are. Insofar as these terrorists are engaged and invested in these people's experiences, they're going to investigate, they're going to find out. I don't really see how they can claim any impacting on this at all. Also, because we've sparked this interest, we have a much better alternate presentation. So we're not saying that these bad things didn't happen, but at least if there's a haka in a rugby game, that's a symbol of integration. That's a symbol of like a unity in our state. That is a symbol that we've moved beyond past gaps in our society and are moving towards inclusion. These kind of symbols are always important. These kind of symbols are always valuable. Now, what's important here is that they've claimed that they would have the iwi or the Indigenous people themselves perform these acts to create their own ads, to spread their own stories, and these are really good because the government is a bad actor. One, it's a very bad choice to hang your whole hat on the government being a bad actor. They must stand behind their world and what this awareness is like in their world. They cannot say, because the government is bad, therefore we win. That is not how this works. Now, self-promotion by Indigenous groups is unrealistic, insofar as we acknowledge, as they've said, that there's inherent structural weaknesses in these groups because of structural and historical inequalities, that there's an absence of funds. And insofar as there are funds, is an iwi really going to invest in an ad about how the haka actually works to an American audience? No. If you did that as an iwi leader, you would be lampooned, because there are much better and much more responsible ways of spending that kind of money. Spending only happens when it makes more money or when it's the best choice for some abstract cause. And insofar as it's not promoting people from outside coming in, i.e. isn't a tourism ad, it isn't going to happen. And insofar as there are always better alternate ways of spending that money by the Indigenous group, it will not happen. Simply, without these ads, they must support a world in which there's no awareness at all promoted overseas, in which our tourism ads are completely devoid of any Indigenous people whatsoever at any time in any place. So what do we have at the end of this? One, what we've shown here is that the form of awareness we have will always be a positive form of awareness. And what we've also shown is that this awareness comes with accountability, in that it is ensured that it will be good because they're an accountable agency. And insofar as this awareness encourages interest by people overseas, it then serves all their goals about solving these problems. Insofar as these people now care more about this kind of thing, it's very odd that they've decided to frame this debate in terms of solving internal problems when these ads are fundamentally external. And I don't really see in their world how an American somehow advocates for land being returned in NZ, or how that even fits in to the debate that we're having now. So at the end of this point, we win that point of clash. On to the second point of clash, tourism revenue. First off, even if these ads are awful, but still bring people in, even if that is true, if there's still a gain in the cold hard cash that these groups get, and if they're in so need of this cold hard cash because of structural inequality and historical injustice, this obviously wins. And they cannot say, well, Indigenous people really, really care about being shown how they truly are. Like, how can you say that? If people make a choice, and if people say, I consent to like be a guide, I consent to be in a haka done in a site for a group of Asian tourists, if they say, I consent to that activity, and that is what I want to show myself as, and I do this because I'm being paid, even if it's not ideal, who are they to suddenly come out and say, no, that's inauthentic, that's not allowed? This person is making a choice. They're consenting to being involved. You cannot say that an act of consent violates some higher cultural duty unless you argue that like some culture is not up for debate and people don't get to decide. If they want people to make a choice, they must accept that people will make the choice to be engaged in this for the money. Now, why is the money guaranteed to go to these people? One, a government cannot just create a fake site. You know, all this stuff only works when it's an actual site. So things like, and this wouldn't work because people value the authenticity. It'll be pretty obvious, like which one is real and which site is actually valuable. And these tourists, insofar as they're spending like a lot of money to come to New Zealand and to see all these things, they aren't going to be fooled by all the white people you've got walking around this this fake village. That really does not work whatsoever in this debate at all. And insofar as these are people being employed, like if you're an Aborigine and you're like hiking on Uluru or something, are they going to put a white employee in an Aborigine mask? Like, how does this work on their side? How do they fake these sites? What they cannot deny and what they have not actually engaged with is that at every stage, when the tourists come, but because they are incentivized by these ads, because their interest is sparked by these ads, money is put directly in the pockets of the most disadvantaged groups. And even if that comes as a trade-off of cultural how realistically their culture is shown, these people consent, these people do this with full understanding of all the impacts that it has, and these people do so out of their own best interest, stand behind Indigenous people acting in their own best interest, stand behind Neg.
Cool, I thank the speaker for that speech, and we'll now move into the reply portion of the debate, and as customary we'll reverse the speaking order, so I call on the leader of the negating team to conclude the negating team's case.
For a side that keeps telling us that culture and history will be forgotten, it seems that side affirming has done a lot of forgetting themselves. They told us on first that their burden was cultural loss. They then switched it on third and said they were trying to prove that the government is a bad actor. They then tried to shove a principle down our throat. It's clear that side affirming doesn't actually have a stance in this debate. Stand with side negating that wants real outcomes for Indigenous communities around the world. What am I going to do in my speech here today? Firstly, I'm going to characterize how these ads function. Then secondly, prove to you why we win on our practical outcomes of like wealth for these communities. And secondly, why we extend our margin of victory with cultural outcomes. Let's talk about firstly how these ads are likely to be characterized. We brought you two pieces of analysis. One, that these are likely to be positive representations because governments want people to come, obviously. And secondly, that they're unlikely to be like racist or bad because governments understand that by putting an ad out, you open yourself up to some level of accountability and backlash. Once we prove that to you, we are able to show to you that the people who are likely to come here as tourists are going to be people who are seeking authentic cultural experiences. This is something that side negating hasn't really actually engaged with, and they've tried to sort of toss around ideas of how these cultural experiences are likely to look. We tell you that if you are incentivized by seeing a traditional cultural like display on an ad, you're likely to come to the country wanting to see an authentic experience. Because of that, all of the material about all these like sort of whitewashed experiences don't really stand. Let's talk about practical outcomes then. And notice that we told you on our burden that we can win if we prove that we get better practical outcomes. Three main reasons why we get better practical outcomes. One, this money goes to the communities. Secondly, governments have an incentive now to invest, which means all their material about reparations that they want to push on us is actually better on our side. And thirdly, we tell you that the government is better at advertising than iwi or like Indigenous groups, which both sides believe are likely to not have the financial means to do that. The only response we heard about this is that like there's going to be these fake communities that are built up or fake experiences, and thus the money isn't likely to go to these communities. We brought you plenty of analysis down the line why this is a completely ridiculous reason why this isn't the case. We tell you that since we prove practical outcomes are better on our side, we automatically win this debate due to revealed preference, because we see that if communities are willing to open out their communities to tourists, they're willing to consent to be in ads, they're willing to consent to open themselves up to the world of tourism, they are in turn valuing economic value over any level of cultural push that side negating wants to push on us. So therefore, we win on economics and we win on this debate. Let's talk about cultural outcomes though, and why we still actually win on this material, even if side negating doesn't want us to. Firstly, we tell you that the connection with tourists is much better on our side. You tell you that tourists go into these authentic experiences and they're able to have a connection with culture. They never told us in this debate how they're actually going to get people to be aware of all of these historical atrocities, are going to be aware of cultures when there is no advertising from like governments on these cultures, and there's no ability for Indigenous communities to actually advertise. Therefore, they get no awareness, no representation. Secondly, then on historical atrocities, again, we win this material because we told you about how, like, when you push up, like, present that culture within like your national ethos, there's now attention to that, and there's that incentive for people to look into the history, especially when you go into these communities and interact with those oral histories between Indigenous people. You learn of those histories in general. Above all, though, we prove to you that when governments put those sort of things in their ads, like culture, among with like their beaches and stuff, just as when you put a beach and the beach does not look like that beach, you hold yourself accountable to that, to like the public eye. When you have a culture within those ads and it's not like how you present, you hold yourself accountable to those backlash. Governments are more incentivized to properly represent culture because we're the side that has better outcomes for Indigenous people. Stand with side negating.
Awesome, I thank the speaker for that speech, and I now call on the leader of the affirming team to wrap up this evening's debate.
Right from the first part of my speech, I told you what Indigenous groups care about, and they care about being able to live in their community, in their culture, on their own terms. Okay, so the other team's case hinges on awareness and hinges on like the money and the investments that the government can bring to them, and we tell you that this is not what matters most to Indigenous people. Okay, what matters most to them is the integrity of the community and the authenticity with which they're able to live with their culture. Okay, so I've got a couple of points to clash. I've got what happens when tourists arrive? What does this awareness look like? What change does it bring? And what value can the government add versus like Indigenous people just doing it on their own? So to start in with, just before I get into those clashes though, I just want to again go over what the Indigenous groups want. So they want to live in their own culture, in peace, and if they want to start a business, they want to do it on their own terms. And so when these tourists arrive, you know, from wherever it is overseas, you've seen these ads, they're coming over here, they are coming into these communities, into these cultural spaces, and they are invading them. Okay, they are taking away this authenticity and this ability for Indigenous groups to live, because they're having to now like sacrifice this space for tourism, which we do not stand behind. We then tell you that this, just by the fact of other people seeing this as a tourist attraction, there's going to be more objectification, there's going to be more racism of these cultures. We think that the characterization they presented of like tourists being able to know when something's inauthentic is not true, and that they like said tourists were going to be so interested in finding out about the culture, and we said this is not the case, because you come on the holiday like for a fun time. You're not like delving into deep research, you're just getting a very superficial level. So there are, and we also told you about the pollution that happens when tourists arrive, which is very harmful to the Indigenous cultures that care about the land. So now getting into what this awareness that was so important to this case looks like, and what change can it bring. So we told you from the start that the government is a particularly bad actor for bringing this awareness, and we said a key part of that is them not wanting to like acknowledge these historical wrong. So they're going to be creating a false narrative that is going to override the voices of the local iwi, because they told us so many times how the government is like more powerful, has more influence. So they are going to be more influential than their local iwi's voices. Which, they said that that takes away the chance of local iwi getting reparations, because them getting reparations hinges on people understanding that there were past harms that need to be fixed. And when you have the government trying to smooth those over and take away this awareness, there's less people aware of this and less people to support local iwi when they're gaining their reparations. And even when the government works with these Indigenous groups, we still see that it comes back to people are coming in and invading their cultural space. They're having to like sacrifice the authenticity with which they live for money, when we think actually on our side of the house, we give them the chance to have their own voice, speak on their own experiences, get people behind the truth of like what they have actually lived, and advocate for reparations in that way. Whereas when we have people coming in, viewing their getting misinformation about their culture, there is the less reparations. And then, so that moves into the next clash about what value can the government add versus Indigenous people. So we tell you that the money and the investment that the government is going to put into these cultures is very low. And, even if the government does offer to like renovate the marae or something like that, Indigenous cultures do not want this, because they do not want like somebody that is not them redoing their cultural space, because that is not what is important to them. So we win this debate because we tell you that we provide what Indigenous cultures actually want, what is actually important to them. Thank you.
Awesome. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I thank all the speakers for such a high quality debate. This concludes round 3 of Nationals Day 1.
Should we go into the prep room for room 5?
Yeah.
Sweet.